Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the November event of the Marxism and Disability Network, which features a talk by Kavana Ramaswamy on disability and immigration, a Marxist analysis of border control. I am Ioana Cerasela-Kish, a member of the MDN steering group, and I will be chairing today's event. As most of you already know from our previous MDN events, the format is as follows. Kavana will be presenting their research for approximately 20 to 30 minutes. Then we will take a 10 minutes comfort break, followed by a questions and answers session with members of the audience. We will aim to end the event no later than 8 p.m. GMT. Just a heads up as well, we will be recording this event, so if you don't want to appear in the video, please turn your camera off. Please also ensure that your microphone is muted at all times, unless, of course, you're invited to make a contribution. Now to introduce our guest contributor, Kavana is a disabled doctoral researcher in law at the University of Cambridge. Their thesis is entitled Creeping Justice, Enabling Theory on Disability. Specifically, they explore the codification of different models of disability in law, the models of equality they reflect, and the impact of these models on justice for disabled people. Kavana is developing the devaluation model as an alternative understanding of disability that addresses the gaps of existing models of disability in envisaging justice. In addition to disability and legal theory, Kavana is also interested in research on human rights, queer theory, and international law. Kavana, would you like to share your slides and please start your presentation? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today I'll be presenting the research on disability and immigration and Marxist analysis of border control. To begin with, I would like to talk about the concept of community of value developed by Bridget Anderson. The community of value, according to Bridget Anderson, is that nationhood is understood through the concept of community of value, which is that people sharing values, behavioral patterns expressed through ethnicity, language, culture, or religion, and legitimized through citizenship is what forms the idea of nationhood. In Anderson's analysis, the community of value essentially marginalizes failed citizens who cannot or do not meet the shared values of the nation state. Failed citizens are granted rights, but they are rarely afforded capacities to exercise these rights that they are granted and afforded. The community of value also marginalizes migrants who meet some of the shared values of the nation state, but are subject to illegitimacy as non-citizens. Exploitation is often the price for admission to legitimacy for non-citizens who are valued and share the values of the nation state, but still face this kind of illegitimacy because they are not citizens. Anderson's own analysis fails to accommodate non-citizens who cannot meet the shared values of the nation state. These non-citizens who cannot meet the values are essentially excluded both within the framework of the community of value and in analyses based on community of value as well. So in my next slide, I have like a table to demonstrate this problem. Give me a second. Next. So what we have here is two axes along which people are classified. One is legitimacy and the other is shared value. Along legitimacy, you have citizens and non-citizens. Along the shared value, you have those who are valued and those who are devalued. This divides people into four essential groups. The first group is the valued citizens, which is citizens who meet the shared values of the nation state. These include values along the lines of sexuality, gender, race, culture, language, religion, or work. The second column is those who are non-citizens and therefore fail the legitimacy qualification of community of value, but are nonetheless valued. And these are essentially what is the narratives around hardworking immigrants or non-racialized immigrants into a nation state. These are people who are essentially understood and accommodated within the nation state, but are not yet granted legitimacy, but are given a path to legitimacy within the state because they are nonetheless valued. The third category of people are failed citizens. These are citizens within the nation state, but who are devalued. They fail along the shared value system. And these include racialized minorities, dependents, criminals, devalued workers, and disabled citizens. The community of value analysis of Anderson essentially draws parallels between valued non-citizens and devalued citizens, claiming that essentially non-citizens, the framework of narrative of how non-citizens who are valued are treated is essential to understanding how devalued citizens are treated as well. And therefore, whatever happens to the valued non-citizens is likely to eventually touch or affect or impact the failed citizens, the devalued citizens. And this is where the analysis draws that parallel. However, in this analysis as well, the people who are excluded are non-citizens who cannot meet the shared values of the community of value. Essentially, this primarily includes disabled non-citizens who are often excluded from immigration laws and deliberately prevented from immigrating into a state. Immigration control maintains nation states overall. First, we have the problem of free movement of capital with restrictions on movement of labor. This involves the globalized community where capital is allowed free movement between nation states through investments, through whether direct or indirect, and this allows people to move money between nation states without much hindrance. This enables capital to seek jurisdictions with fewer labor restrictions in order to ensure greater access to exploitable labor. There is also pressure on labor within states to forego bargaining power in order to access employment from capital. And affordance of free movement also extends to capitalists through the formation of systems like golden visas, where anyone with capital is allowed access to the community of value or access to nationhood through investment. And this essentially sometimes even forgoes access to the community of value system because the capital itself is considered as the value for the community of value. An example of this would be when Peter Thiel accessed the citizenship of New Zealand. There are several restrictions, including in the golden visas that migrants are supposed to meet in order to attain citizenship. Nonetheless, Peter Thiel was given citizenship of New Zealand without having met any of those criteria. This is where capital by itself becomes an underlying value for citizenships or access to the community of value of nationhood and citizenship. This exacerbates global class structures as well, because capitalists moving from the global south essentially gain access to class systems of countries of the global north, exacerbating the systems and class structures existing in the global south as well. The narratives around immigration also tend to separate economic migrants from refugees, and this separation obscures the problems that everyone faces in the capitalist system of having the obligation to sell labor. This obligation exists for both migrants and refugees. And there are problems as well where refugees are prevented from working until they have access to legitimacy through the system. And while migrants are either allowed to work or not allowed to work, depending on their status of being documented or undocumented. Furthermore, undocumented migrants face additional exploitation in being pushed to work in order to prevent them from being subjected to the policing state on the basis of their not being documented. The right to the way in which the nation states are maintained through immigration control can be rooted from through the post Second World War and Cold War eras. What happened was the rights that were enumerated by states through international law included a right to leave any country, which is recognized under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights under Article 13.2 and the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights under Article 12.2. What is missing from this is a corresponding right to enter any country, which is still negotiated and maintained by states in order to prevent entry into their own countries. This is any right to enter a country is restricted and highly precarious. And it is mainly granted to people on either their status as being a capitalist or their status of being exploitable by capital. Citizenship is thus promised to migrants at the end of a threshold amount of labor exploitation in order to encourage self-selection by immigrants, and ease of access granted to states is granted to states that take on this policing of movement for citizens within their own countries. An example of this is the agreement between the EU and Turkey, where Turkey agreed to prevent migrants from entering the EU for the benefit of Turkish citizens being allowed visa-free travel into Europe on the basis of the Turkish state meeting certain obligations of preventing migrants' entry into Europe. Border control essentially creates illegality in labor movement, pushing devalued work onto undocumented migrants that increase exploitability and reduce the cost of labor. There are several scholars who have conflicting opinions on whether immigration in general increases, reduces, or has no impact on the cost of labor or the cost of goods in a country. However, most of these analyses miss out the problem that it is border control that actually creates the precarity that makes labor more precarious and reduces the rights of laborers in the country. Border control creates the illegality of migrants and additionally ensures that access to devalued work happens for undocumented migrants. And this is done and scholars have often looked at the ways in which when border control increases, there are an increasing number of people using underground methods in order to increase the number of undocumented migrants within a country to raise precarity of such migrants and ensure that devalued work is further devalued in terms of how much money is paid to these laborers for the work done. Border control has additional impacts on disabled people. The Convention on the CRP, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, under Article 18(1)(c), like the UDHR and the ICCPR, includes the right to acquire and change a nationality, and requires states to not deprive disabled citizens of their nationality arbitrarily on the basis of disability. This article essentially says that while they have a right to acquire and change nationality, the only thing that they will not be deprived of on the basis of their disability is their own nationality. This does not require states to grant nationality without discrimination on the basis of disability. Further, countries have reservations against Article 18. Example, Bhutan and Kuwait have explicit restrictions reservations against Article 18 of the CRPD. Other countries like Australia have interpretative reservations which permit wherein Australia reserves for itself the right to continue to implement health-based restrictions that bar people from entry into Australia. Other countries such as Canada explicitly have rules against disabled people seeking citizenship or entry into Canada or permanent residency on the basis of their likely to become dependents or likely to become dependent on the public welfare resources. National anti-discrimination laws, including for instance, under the Equality Act in UK, also are often exempt immigration from the prohibition of disability-based discrimination. This means that while countries still have anti-discrimination law for the purpose of employment or provision of services, the provision of services such as immigration is not included within these anti-discrimination laws. Border control and disablement. Border control also exacerbates the problem of disablement in many countries. This is because access to healthcare is often bounded within the borders of a nation state. Access to healthcare is subject to stringent border controls. Disabled migrants seeking healthcare are often required to prove that they will not become a burden on public welfare. In the UK, for instance, if you are a migrant, you are required to pay an extra NHS surcharge, regardless of whether you are employed in work and therefore already pay the regular NHS surcharge as a part of your salary. This is essentially doubly taxing migrants in order to ensure that they pay twice the amount for healthcare as citizens. Orphan drug rules in countries allow private companies to dictate the price of drugs for rare conditions, making them largely unaffordable to people in underdeveloped countries. This problem is evident, for instance, in the case of hemophilia. Managing hemophilia becomes possible with access to prophylactic treatments in the form of blood coagulation injections. These are, for instance, offered by the NHS in the UK as a part of prophylactic treatment if you have hemophilia. However, access to these drugs in underdeveloped countries is extremely difficult, not only because the price of the drugs is unaffordable to many countries, but also privately accessing these drugs becomes prohibitively expensive because of orphan drug rules that are granted as a part of exemptions to patents in countries where these pharmaceutical companies operate. So these pharmaceutical companies essentially seek these orphan drug exemptions because they are rare conditions, and therefore the claim is essentially that the research putting money into research requires an exorbitant amount of money to be paid for these drugs, and therefore justify exorbitant pricing for orphan drugs. TRIPS obligations for member states of WTO requires countries to implement product patents as opposed to process patents, raising once again the price of pharmaceuticals in many countries. Process patents were largely used by underdeveloped and developing countries prior to the establishment of the World Trade Organization. Process patents allow pharmaceuticals to patent a drug on the basis of the process of manufacture, which allows other companies to manufacture the drug using different processes in order to ensure that the prices of drugs remain low. However, the World Trade Organization, the TRIPS agreement requires countries to implement product patents, which means that once a company has a patent on a product, other companies cannot produce it at all using different processes, raising the cost of drugs again. Medical tourism further raises the cost of healthcare in underdeveloping countries by sapping resources from public healthcare into private healthcare to meet the increasing demands of citizens from developed countries seeking cheap private healthcare in underdeveloped countries. All of these are operated through border control and ensure that the problem of disablement is exacerbated through a lack of access to healthcare in developing countries. This further exacerbates the problems of wealth disparities, both across countries and within countries for disabled people in underdeveloped and developing countries. Thus, we see that the borders of exclusion operate at different forms against disabled people. National borders create boundaries on whose concerns are legitimized or valued by globalized capitalism. The exclusion of disabled non-citizens under the framework of the community of value draws borders on the appropriate subjects of study for the question of nationhood and for the question of marginalization under nationhood. Measures of inclusion, including international law and accommodation laws, further divide disabled people along the lines of value. disabled people who can aspire to communities of value through accommodations, which is essentially restricted to reasonable accommodations, are permitted marginalized inclusion, but those who are not are once again excluded from the communities of value. Thus, we see that dismantling borders is a valuable goal for both labor and disability rights movements as a way of stemming the problem of globalized capitalism in exacerbating these problems. Thank you. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, Kavana. I think it's now time to move to a comfort break for 10 minutes and then we'll be back. So everyone, please think about any questions you may have and then we'll start the conversation after those 10 minutes. So we'll be back at 5 past.
Okay.
Just waiting a few more seconds before we start. So if anyone has got any burning questions, please do either write them in the chat or raise your hands via the Zoom setting. I can see one volunteer. Thank you very much, Bob. I will spotlight you right now. And please do ask your question.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation, which I largely agree with. However, I think we are seeing a slight shift in what is required by capital, and that has had implications in terms of how certain group of disabled people are looked upon and related to. We often hear people talk about a hierarchy of disability when they actually mean a hierarchy of impairment groups. There are certain groups that are seen to be favoured as opposed to other groups. We have also seen how the neoliberal policies, anti-welfare and increased commodification, I believe, has meant that certain capital in certain countries do not just look at the capacity to labour or the exploitative value, but they are increasingly also looking at the skill set that are impairment related. And I'm wondering whether that is reflected in the border control measures that exist or could exist in the future.
Okay, thank you. I understand, like, what you're saying is that the distinction between impairment and disability is something that is not adequately understood within the system of within the global system by which disabled people are excluded, and this remains a problem. Of course, I avoided using the social model or any model specifically for this presentation, mainly because I didn't want to go into the details of the social model at this point. And yes, there is a space where access to healthcare does increase the incidence of impairment rather than disablement. But access to technological tools for accommodations, for instance, will also increase the problem of disablement, because accommodative tools are not afforded enough access in underdeveloped countries. If I do agree that capital increasingly does not make the distinction between impairment and disability, but I think that actually is a part of the problem of capitalism, in that it does not intend to do that, which is where as I said before, uh, those who can be accommodated with reasonable accommodations into the community of value are afforded marginalized inclusion, whereas those who are excluded are essentially those who cannot work. For instance, for a lot of people, for instance, right now with long COVID, cannot work, and therefore are not afforded any kind of inclusion in either the community of value or in legitimacy in some way. And this remains a problem. Yeah.
Can I come back quickly?
Yes, please.
I don't disagree with what you said, but I don't think you've understood the
Okay.
point I'm getting at, which is I think certain groups of people who are impaired, that given the nature of their impairment, can be prioritized. Let me give you an example. Some people who are autistic make great workers in the computer, computer industry. Therefore, you can see a different approach to them compared to other group of impaired workers who may be able to sell their labour. So I'm wondering whether that distinction is becoming more obvious or not.
I'm not sure at this point. I think that's something I will have to think about more seriously, and I appreciate the I appreciate the suggestion to look into that more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, would you like to ask a question?
Hi. Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting. And it's really interesting to get your ideas about the international context like that. A couple of things first, just sort of factual questions. I'm not sure if it's true that migrants don't have access to the Equality Act. That the Equality Act doesn't. That there's a reservation on that. There is in the UN Convention from the UK, but I didn't think there was on the Equality Act. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a law person. So that's just a factual question. And then the other thing, I mean, it sort of builds on what Bob was asking, I think. So I know that what you were talking about, how in Australia and New Zealand, I think, where there's disabled people or people with specific health conditions have restricted access to migration. And I was wondering how you think that compares with the systems that there have been in Britain, like the vulnerable persons relocation scheme, where in theory, disabled people are specifically selected for greater migration rights and privileged status relative to people seeking asylum. So on the basis of supposedly being vulnerable. And I'm wondering how you think those two, whether you think those are opposites or whether you think they're actually part of the same problem.
So two things. On your first question, I didn't say that migrants don't have access to the Equality Act. What I said specifically was that the Equality Act specifically for disability non-discrimination does not apply to the issue of immigration. So in seeking to enter or leave the UK, you cannot access the right to non-discrimination as a non-citizen seeking a right to enter the UK on the basis of disability. So the exemption is specifically that people making the decision on allowing someone to enter, remain, or stay in the UK can make this decision on the basis of disability without being hit by the Equality Act. Migrants in the UK have access to the Equality Act. That is not in question. But before you enter the UK, the question of immigration is not subject to non-discrimination on the basis of disability. And this remains true in the UK, for instance, with health qualifications, where every person seeking a short-term stay in the UK has to go through a tuberculosis check in countries where there is no visa-free travel into the UK. And this remains a problem. This is also additionally privatized in the globalized system, where specific health agencies are authorized to do this check for the UK government. And other healthcare providers cannot do this. So it's like, once again, this trade-off of like, we will privatize and we will enable you to ensure that border control is policed from either private entities or other countries in order to ensure that the policing happens without much intervention or much requirement for the state itself. And they also become increasingly, because these are private entities, you can't appeal any decisions. They're all just very randomized in terms of how the private entity deals with these cases. On your second question on how Australia or Canada compared to the UK on vulnerable migrants, I don't have the details about vulnerable migrants in the UK on that front. I do know, however, I did not say New Zealand. I think it was Australia and Canada that I was talking about that explicitly exclude disabled people from migration into the UK. This is a problem also in the UK, as I said before, with the health checks that are imposed on anyone who enters the UK. There's also the recent illegal migration act in the UK, which exacerbates the problem regardless of vulnerability, where if you have entered the UK illegally, you will not be granted any of the rights to asylum by default. And this exacerbates the problem by which many people who are brought into UK, including as vulnerable people, for instance, through trafficking, are often kept and threatened with their undocumented status as a way of further exploiting their vulnerability within the UK itself. I hope that answers your question.
Rebecca, would you like to respond or?
Yeah, thanks. It was me that added the thing about news. Like people have to have a health, I can't remember what it's called, but there's a thing where people have to have a health check before they become migrants in New Zealand. But anyway,
that's true for most developed countries at this point.
Yeah, but I was wondering, so my question was more specifically on how or whether you think that the system in Britain, where there's specific occasions where people are selected on the basis of being vulnerable, whether you think that is actually part of the same problem, or you think it's the opposite.
That is the thing that I haven't looked into in detail.
Okay.
My anticipation is, again, separating people into vulnerable, non-vulnerable is a way in which border control is, what do you call it, exacerbated rather than reduced. The problem of border control is not that there are legal versus, not that it separates in, like, there are illegal migrants. The problem is it creates this illegality. All migrants are at some level vulnerable to exploitation, and this is true for documented migrants as well. In being documented migrants, they are also required to ensure that they do not lose their job at any point of time. They face reduced incentive to organize as laborers in a country because of their precarity as documented workers. So I don't think that separating the vulnerable, like creating a separate system for vulnerable, or looking at the question of legal migrants as somehow separate from illegal migrants actually makes sense because of the precarity of everyone involved. And to continue into the question that Fina has given in the chat, which actually also speaks to this problem right now, which is that migrants who become disabled are often kicked out of the country because either because they fail to meet the health requirements of migration at that point, or because they fail to meet the community of value requirements of being exploitable by capital. So, for instance, if you come into the UK and you've had long COVID and you can't work anymore, you will not be allowed to stay in the UK. You will be kicked out. And the hostile environment in the UK has essentially made this all much worse, because the moment you have a vulnerable person, the Home Office believes that the best way to prevent further vulnerability is to send them back to their country of origin.
Thank you very much. I've just seen one other question asking, did you say orphan medication, and what did you mean by that, or did the attendee miss here?
Sorry,
So just the second last message asked about whether you said orphan medication.
Orphan drugs. So orphan drugs are essentially an exemption to patent schemes where drug price regulation is not covered. It does not cover orphan drugs. The orphan drugs are essentially drugs for rare conditions where there's a tiny minority of people who need the drug, and therefore pharmaceuticals seek exemptions for researching and manufacturing those drugs, by which they can essentially put really high prices on those drugs. For countries like the UK, where the NHS affords medical care, essential medical care for people, such drugs can be afforded by states, especially developed states, where public health care is given this affordance. But for a lot of underdeveloped countries, accessing those drugs, even as a nation state, is difficult or impossible. And therefore, those drugs become prohibitively expensive for people in underdeveloped countries.
Thank you. I would like to invite Ariana to pose a question.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Kavana. That was just wonderful presentation. Yeah, I think my question is based on on the picture you've built up, the very detailed pictures of different borders of exclusion, and I was wondering where you see there is, so it feels as if there is really an intersection of multiple structures of vulnerabilization of populations. So my question is, where you see there is best ground for challenging these? For example, would you say that it's very much at the legal level that we need to mobilize around? For example, so would you say that movements, that it's not we are not even at the stage of talking about solidarity. Yeah, that's a question. And yeah, so where do we need to focus on? So that would be one, in the sense that often we talk a lot about being in solidarity with each other, but but the picture that you've laid out draws the attention to a more structural level in a way, where we need to start. But yeah, so I was wondering about where not in terms of priorities of levels or dimensions, but I'm really wondering where you see there is most possibility for putting pressure, making change. So that would be one. And the second, so maybe I have another question, but maybe I will just leave for space for other people to ask. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ariana. The grounds for challenging this are pretty wide. I think there's like a lot of scope for access, whether through law or labor movements or general general cultural narratives. I think one aspect of this is that labor movements need to improve their what do you call it, unionization for and across migrant workers. This is being done by some labor movements, but there's like huge divides in how different classes of workers view immigrant labor. There's definitely a lot more polarization around anti-immigration sentiments, especially amongst the working class in the US, the UK, and other countries as well. And this is a problem which needs to be pushed back against. Of course, all of this is like things that we need to do that I feel very overwhelmed with the amount of work and the extent of difficulty that involves. And I appreciate that, but that is one way. With law, I am less optimistic as a lawyer about how much law can actually change this, given that I'm very much of the opinion that law basically is a tool for capital to continue to exert control. However, if there is sufficient organization around labor rights, these can be pushed through law as well as an institution. I'm less optimistic about that myself. The third way in which I would work on this is changing the narratives around immigration in general, both within and outside the movements, which is not obscuring the problems of how capitalism operates through borders in order to exacerbate the problems of workers, reiterating that it's not immigration but border control that makes work more precarious and dismantles labor rights both within and across countries. That is a thing that we need to push back on, which is to say it's not immigration, it's border control that makes labor precarious, and that is what we need to be fighting against, as opposed to fighting against migration as like the problem that labor faces. And I think, yeah, those are the three things that I would recommend as ways to move against this.
Thank you. Ariana, would you like to pose your next question? I think we have time.
Yes, thanks so much, Kavana. That was really amazing, and also grounds for hope that you see really organizing with the labor movement, and also the connection to the change of narrative around this. So I think my question, so maybe my question would be a question just to, then. Which maybe hearing your answer helped me clarify that second question that I had. It's still not very clear, but so I would say then, what's the so if organizing at the level of labor movements is where there is most scope for emancipation or making some kind of change or building some kind of power or counter power, and then how about the other scenarios that you were providing, but in terms of migrants who are not workers. So where then, so the question is there, so for those of us who are in that situation or people we know, is there any agency or solidarity to be found there, in the sense if the main dimension where we could build some kind of power, counter-power solidarity is at the level of the labor movement, how about those other populations of disabled people and migrants not working, not able to work? So how about that, who are still part of the working class but who cannot work? So how about those populations, would be my question, I suppose. And so that's in terms of organizing, but also at the level of narrative. How do we make a case? How strong would you say is the case of like in just working at the level of community of value? So the initial framework that you were introducing, is there any possibility or use of inverting the narrative, as you were saying, just starting from the right of people, disabled migrants unable to work, wanting no borders, and putting the priority on free access to those as communities of people we want, that even more than a migrant worker, or even just from, and I'm talking of this from a Marxist perspective, so rejecting that, rejecting value as the ground where we are, where we assign preferability to one or the other. Yes, thanks.
Yeah. So I definitely agree with the idea of rejecting hierarchies of value for people in general, and this is something I've sort of worked on in my previous papers as well, and with my devaluation model. Your question on is there any agency or solidarity to be found for organizing for migrants who are not workers? I definitely think there is a lot of scope for agency and solidarity in that space, specifically with the increasing privatization and securitization of border control, where not only is it that border control is privatized, including through, for instance, border agencies, detention camps, all of these are essentially privatized agencies contracted by the state. There's definitely a more liberal/libertarian push for what is known as open borders. And those narratives tend to say open borders will increase wealth and value for the communities that open borders do, which is still pushing the narrative of value, which is why I would recommend pushing for no borders and dismantling borders as opposed to saying open borders, because that still says, oh, we still value this community of value, which we want to preserve because capitalism is great. Yes. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any other questions? I've got a few prepared as well, but Bob, please do go ahead.
Yeah, I want to come back on more of two things. I understand why you didn't want to talk about more models, but I think there's one issue that needs to be thought about in a practical way. You are right to say there's been an increase in collapsing together impairment and disability. We see that in the international classification of functioning. I think there's also confusion over what meant by breaking the causal link between impairment and disability. it did not mean there is no connection. It meant that the impairment itself was not the direct cause of our social disadvantage or exclusion. The reason I'm raising this now is that I think we need to look at the more agitational way how our impairments and ill health are used against us by the capitalist system, and that is a deliberate engagement to not only exploit but also to manage non-productive people. Yeah, and their social use value, and the importance of that is not just oppression or discrimination, but also how eugenics and assisted suicide is becoming more and more evident in the push for profit.
I just want to clarify if I understand what you're saying. You're stating that the problem of not separating impairment and disability is that capital essentially uses impairments against disabled people within the capitalist system, and this further marginalizes non-productive people in that system but I'm not sure what the reason for that is. Sorry.
Okay, first of all, I do support the separation, but I think people misunderstand what is meant by that. I believe capital do use your health and impairment against us. And I think they do that in a variety of ways. So I think we've got to find ways that are more productive in explaining how that happened and why it happened without falling into bringing disability and impairment into that collapse way of looking at it. And I ended up by saying that, in my opinion, capital is making more effort to divide and rule by actually getting rid of more non-productive people.
May I ask, I've got some ideas in mind that's kind of examples, Bob, of maybe what you're referring to in terms of how impairments are used against us. And I just wonder if that would be a good addition to the discussion. So for instance, Ian Duncan Smith went to give a talk to employers and say, do employ disabled people because they, and he did explicitly say that they are grateful to be given a job. They will be, over-exploiting themselves for free. They will be working extra for free because they are so grateful. So they're useful for your company. So that's a way of using impairment against us. And then another example that comes to mind is from human resource management journal articles where the case has been made in favor of neurodivergent people from the perspective of, hey, managers, employ ADHDers because they are more creative and they bring value to your firm and so on in a very particular way. And then if you don't conform to the stereotypes of ADHD, or if you're a different neurodivergent person, then this kind of hierarchy is maintained because there are those whom we want to keep and recruit and so on, and then those others whom actually might not fit within the organization. So would you say that these would be some examples of impairments being used against us? Okay, excellent, thank you. Kavana, how do you respond to Bob's?
Yes, I agree with this. I think this is kind of what I was talking about when I was talking about the reasonable accommodations being like people who fit within the reasonable accommodation system are afforded marginalized access to the community of value. It is still very much marginalized access, and the space where I would move away from, like, I don't think it is necessarily the impairment or the disablement which is used against. It's like both, or sometimes either, sometimes both. In either case, there is a space of marginalization in which disabled people are afforded, what do you call it, restricted access to the community of value, while others are essentially excluded. The space in which disablement is also, I think, used against disabled people in this access to in this marginalized access to community is, for instance, the requirement that disabled people have to seek out accommodations on our own, or are made responsible for essentially ensuring our own accommodations. That is where I feel it's not impairment but disablement which is also used against us. So yeah, this is where it's like, I appreciate the need for separation of impairment and disability, but for the purpose of analysis in this paper, it seemed like they were both relevant and not, what do you call it, the separation felt like it would further divide the space of disabled people as like, am I impaired? Am I being exploited because I'm disabled or because I'm impaired? And it's both neither and both in a lot of cases. Yeah. But yes, capital does make more effort to divide people as much as possible, and that's a space in which laborers are essentially told that migration is why their labor rights are being eviscerated, but it's not actually migration that is eviscerating labor rights. It's border control that is doing so. But this ensures that laborers are divided into national laborers versus migrant laborers, and therefore are split up from being able to organize together against capital. And yes.
Thank you. Rebecca, would you like to ask a question?
Unless you want to go first, you had your hand up first. Yeah, I just wanted to add to what you were just talking about the like what Ian Duncan Smith said about people with certain impairments being, or disabled people being better workers because they're more keen to work, or some nonsense like that. But I was wondering how you think that relates to the campaigns that exist for the right to work for people in the asylum system, and how certainly some of those charities or voluntary sector organisations that campaign for it and call it common sense, they frame it in terms of how people seeking asylum are so desperate to work and how we can stop people being a burden. So I was wondering if you see parallels between that and Ian Duncan Smith's stuff about disability.
Yes, I definitely see parallels in all forms of marginalization at the end of the day, because under a capitalist system, the right to work, the obligation to work becomes the right to work. And that is where exploitation happens. It's because you no longer want to work because you desire to produce something of value. It's because you have to produce something of value in order to survive. Or you have to produce something that is valued in the capitalist system in order to survive. Because you as a person are no longer valued unless you can produce value within that system. And that is where I do generally advocate for the disconnection of work from value for all people, including disabled people, because for a lot of disabled people, this is where exclusion and marginalization happens repeatedly. I definitely disagree with the narrative of access to work because they are desperate to work and that will reduce the burden as being the framework. I definitely think we need increased taxes in order to ensure that welfare rights are more solidified with, and this is where I keep going back to universal basic services and universal basic income, which essentially decouples value from work, which is what I would ideally like. But yes, until we have the utopia and have overthrown our capitalist masters, yes. Yeah.
Thank you. George, would you like to ask a question?
Good evening, Maud. It is to continue on the topic because I am particularly on the notion of the Ian Duncan Smith comment. It just also highlight the important needs of union activity so that the individual that they think they could exploit will learn how to have the ammunition of um of solidarity, as it were. In other words, I think this is also an opportunity to think about methods of resistance and how to build up the needed networks so that an injury for one is an injury for all, as it were, which is also important for the ensuring needed, if we are going to need to ensure an alliance between migration movements, especially the asylum-seeking ones, and the disability rights movement. Because in the end, we need that basic framework of solidarity, as well as, of course, the importance, again, the rights of the make use of unionism as a way to help ensure that the power is held by the workers, not the bosses.
Yeah, I agree with this essentially. We do need solidarity between different aspects of marginalization and exclusion in order to build up organizational strength against capitalist systems. There are, of course, problems with doing this, and one example of this would be the case of Fiat Fiat, the company in Italy, where Fiat essentially threatened to move all of its factories out of Italy because there was easier access to cheap labor outside in underdeveloped countries. And what happened was an agreement between the Union of Laborers in Italy and the company Fiat, whereby they agreed to reduced labor and union rights in the company in order to ensure that the factory was not moved out. And this was essentially the modus operandi for Fiat in a lot of places, where essentially they were workers agreed, for instance, like the lack of to reduced rights to strike, reduced rights to unionization, and reduced leaves in order to ensure that the factory was still maintained, because access to work was still very much a problem within the capitalist system where everyone is required to work in order to survive. And if the factory was moved away to a different country, they would lose their access to livelihood, which is masked as a right to work. Yeah.
Thank you. As there are no hands raised at the moment, I am going to ask a few brief questions. I've scribbled down some questions and I hope I can remember them or understand my writing. But to start with, I was just wondering, so you've mentioned your politics being an abolitionist politics towards borders, and I was just wondering what would you say, how would you characterize your politics in relation to disability? So what are you trying to combine border abolition with? Is there a particular model or a particular, I don't know, political vantage point that you're taking in relation to disability. Secondly, I was wondering what areas of, just for your project, are there particular areas of law that you're looking into, or is the UN and UN CRPD and other like UN related policies on migration that you're looking into? And then what about the ILO, the International Labour Organization? Does it have what kind of role and power does it have to challenge some of these matters that you've discussed, such as the impact of borders and bordering on disabled people? I'll leave it there for now, and then I might ask a few more questions later on.
Okay, my abolitionist policies for borders. What about disability? I think parallelly taking the social model into account, my politics for disability is abolishment of disablement as well, in the sense of disablement as restrictions on access to community, society, public spaces, or access to society more generally. That is what needs to be abolished. But parallelly, that cannot be framed within spaces of work, because my abolitionist policies also extend to work as well. Abolishment of work as the framework on which people are allowed to live within a capitalist system. And this is what I extend to disablement as well, which is, I guess, the underlying all of this is essentially abolishing ideas of hierarchical value as the manner in which lives or people are valued within the system. What areas of law am I looking at? I don't, as I said before, as someone who has gone through legal training, I'm fairly skeptical of the space in which law can be a useful tool for change. I think even if it is a tool for change, it usually gets co-opted by the capitalist system. So even the small spaces in which you have, marginal increase of rights for people, by and large, they eventually get co-opted by the capitalist system, and it no longer operates as a framework by which people's rights are extended. Thus, when I use examples of law, especially for like international law or national legislation, they're mainly to exemplify the problem, as opposed to suggesting, oh, that is what needs to change, because I frankly don't believe that is viable. Certainly, international law, I don't believe has any capacity to manifest change in the world, primarily because of the way in which international law is not binding on states. Certainly, the CRPD, states can adhere to, or states can become signatories and ratify a particular convention, but they are not required to implement these in their national legislation, except in a very loose manner of being a part of the community of value in the international level. And that community of value is easily negated without too much trouble. An example with the CRPD in labor, again, is in the exceptions that states have made reservations against Article 18. A number of different, as I said in the presentation itself, Article 18, which allows the right to leave or gain citizenship of a country. A number of countries from the global north have objected to these reservations, but they have mainly objected to reservations of countries from the global south. There is no mention of the reservation by Australia, which still allows for health exemptions, which targets Article 18 but does not explicitly speak of Article 18. Nor is there any objection to the national policies of the global north in excluding disabled people from immigration, or excluding non-discrimination against disability in immigration law. And yes, the ILO the ILO was established after the First World War, but by and large, its operations have sort of been watered down into the operation of global trade, especially under the WTO. And so it no longer has I don't know if it ever had the capacity to support or push for labor movement rights. But in any case, as a subsidiary of the UN, it predominantly operates as an arm of the states that operate in the international level, which means it is essentially a tool for capital again.
Thank you so much for these very comprehensive and concise responses. I agree. I guess my final question, and if anyone else has any burning questions, please do raise your hands. We've got just a few minutes left, but my final question for now is, what about sources of hope? Do you have examples of particular campaigns within the UK or beyond, or international campaigns that do provide some sort of a, not necessarily blueprint, but some tools that we can work with to then advance the politics that you've just mentioned earlier? Yeah. Which campaigns are kind of closest to what you think is kind of the best stuff that's happening at the moment, if any?
That is unfortunately hard to say, because I haven't actually seen material success in the change of material conditions for people by and large, including, for instance, we did have a lot of the civil rights movements of the 60s were effective in granting civil rights, but those civil rights have essentially become co-opted, where at this point there is marginal improvement for the lives of those covered under the Civil Rights Acts, including disabled people, which came in, especially in the US in the 70s after the Rehabilitation Act was passed. But all of these are marginal improvements that don't hit at the root of the problem, which is essentially the capitalist system. I haven't seen a system that has managed to overthrow that yet. So the best I can say is we need more organized protest, we need more solidarity, and the only source of hope is that we're still trying to do this work. And that's the only thing we can keep doing. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I don't see any other hands raised. I would like to thank you so much, Kavana, for coming to speak to us today. This was a truly enjoyable event and talk and discussion. For everyone else in the room, I just would like to highlight that our next event will be taking place on the 3rd of December, and I will be presenting, so I need to work on that presentation. But yeah, I will see you on the Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. 6:30 GMT, as usual, for our final event of the year. And then also in December, we will be very likely releasing the schedule for 2025. Thank you everyone to all of those who've submitted their proposals for next year. And until then, I would like to say thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
And I hope you have a good rest of the week.